I never thought I'd hear those words from my own grandson. "You're just a burden, Grandma Betty. Maybe it's time you accepted that." The Thanksgiving table fell silent. 23 people, 3 generations of the Morrison family, sat frozen, their forks suspended halfway to their mouths, cranberry sauce dripping back onto bone china plates. The only sound was the gentle hum of the heating system that I had personally upgraded just 2 years earlier, when I'd quietly replaced the old furnace in this sprawling colonial home in Westfield, Massachusetts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My grandson, Tyler, 24, years old and fresh out of business school with an MBA that had cost his parents nearly $200,000, stared at me across the mahogany dining table with a mixture of frustration and what looked disturbingly like disgust. His words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and suffocating. "Tyler," his mother, my daughter-in-law Rebecca, hissed under her breath, her manicured fingers gripping her wine glass so tightly I worried it might shatter. But she didn't contradict him. Neither did my son Michael, who sat at the head of the table, in the chair that had once belonged to his father, my late husband Harold. Michael's eyes darted between Tyler and me, clearly torn between defending his mother and supporting his son's ambition to speak truth to power, as he'd been calling it lately. The rest of the family, Tyler's younger sister Emma, his cousins, from Rebecca's side, various aunts and uncles, all stared at their plates as if the turkey and stuffing held the secrets of the universe. The children's table in the adjacent sunroom had gone quiet too, little ears straining to understand why the adults had suddenly stopped talking. What Tyler didn't know, what none of them knew except for my attorney James Whitmore and the property management company I'd hired 15 years ago, was that the deed to this very house, this impressive 4-bedroom colonial with its chef's kitchen, finished basement, and 2-car garage, was filed under the name Elizabeth M. Morrison, my name. The mortgage that Michael and Rebecca had been faithfully paying for the past 11 years, that money went directly into an account I controlled, funding everything from the new roof they'd celebrated getting approved for financing to the landscaping project Rebecca had gushed about to her garden club friends. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain how a 78-year-old widow who Tyler assumed was living on Social Security and the kindness of family had come to own not just this house, but 3 other properties in the greater Boston area, plus a portfolio that would have made his business school professors weep with envy. It started, as these things often do, with a lie. Not malicious, mind you, but a protective lie told by a grieving widow who had just discovered that her husband's meticulous financial planning had left her with far more than anyone realized. When Harold died 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack, I'd been devastated. We'd been married for 52 years, and I genuinely believed I knew everything about our financial situation. We lived modestly, a small ranch house in nearby Springfield, used cars driven until they couldn't be repaired anymore, vacations that consisted of camping trips and visits to relatives. What I discovered in Harold's papers, locked away in a safety deposit box I'd never known existed, was that my husband had been far more than the careful machinist he'd appeared to be. Harold Morrison had been an investor, a quiet genius who'd spotted opportunities in small tech companies, real estate markets before they boomed, and stock picks that had compounded for decades. The modest lifestyle hadn't been about necessity. It had been about choice, about values, about not wanting wealth to corrupt the simple happiness we'd built together. The revelation came with a note in Harold's careful handwriting. "Betty, you have choices now that we never discussed because I wanted you to make them as the woman you became after I'm gone, not as the wife you were while I was here. Trust your instincts, trust your heart, and remember that money is a tool, not a master." So I'd made my choices. I'd sold our little ranch house and moved into a modest apartment in an assisted living community in downtown Springfield. Not because I needed assistance, but because I wanted the social interaction and the freedom from maintenance responsibilities. I'd let my family assume that Harold's pension and Social Security were stretching to cover my needs, maybe with a small savings account for emergencies. I'd dressed simply, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and carefully managed every conversation about money to suggest gentle financial limitations without ever actually lying. Meanwhile, I'd been busy. I'd purchased Michael and Rebecca's house when they were struggling to qualify for a mortgage during the 2012 economic uncertainty, structuring it as an owner-financed arrangement that gave them pride in their accomplishment while ensuring they'd never face foreclosure. I'd bought Tyler's student apartment building near Boston University, keeping his rent reasonable while building equity in prime real estate. I'd even purchased the small office building where Rebecca worked as a marketing coordinator, though she had no idea her landlord was her mother-in-law. It wasn't about control. It was about security, about making sure my family would be safe even if they never knew how that safety was being provided. Harold's note had been right. I was making choices as the woman I'd become, and that woman wanted to protect her family while teaching them the value of independence and hard work. But as I sat at that Thanksgiving table, listening to my grandson explain to me why I needed to face reality about my financial limitations and consider moving to more appropriate housing for someone in my situation, I realized that my well-intentioned secrecy had created an unintended consequence. Tyler saw me not as a capable woman who had earned respect through decades of quiet strength, but as a burden to be managed, a problem to be solved, an elderly relative whose pride needed to be gently but firmly overcome for the good of the family. Grandma. Betty, Tyler continued, his voice taking on the patient tone one might use with a confused child. I know you're attached to your independence, but we have to be practical here. The assisted living place is nice, but it's expensive, and Mom and Dad are already stretched thin with the mortgage and Emma's college fund. We can't keep subsidizing your lifestyle when there are more economical options available. The irony was so complete, so perfectly absurd that I almost laughed. Here was my grandson, sitting in a house I owned, lecturing me about financial responsibility, while assuming I was a drain on resources that I was actually providing. But the laughter died in my throat when I saw the expressions around the table, the uncomfortable agreement, the resigned acceptance that Tyler was simply saying what everyone had been thinking. They all saw me as a burden. And it was time to set the record straight. What my family saw when they looked at me was Elizabeth Morrison, 78 years old, widow of a machinist, resident of Sunset Manor Assisted Living. They saw sensible shoes from Payless, cardigans from Walmart, and a woman who clipped coupons and worried about the cost of prescription medications. They saw someone who needed their help, their guidance, their careful management of expectations and resources. What they didn't see was the woman who had spent the last 5 years building a real estate empire worth over $12 million. Every Tuesday morning, while my family assumed I was attending water aerobics or playing bridge with the other residents at Sunset Manor, I was actually sitting in conference rooms across Greater Boston, reviewing property acquisitions with my investment team. The sensible shoes were a deliberate choice, comfortable for walking through construction sites and commercial buildings. The simple cardigans hid the fact that I could afford designer clothing, but chose not to waste money on appearances when there were better uses for capital. My attorney, James Whitmore, had initially been skeptical when I'd walked into his office 5 years ago with Harold's documents and a plan that seemed impossibly ambitious for a recent widow. Mrs. Morrison, he'd said, peering at me over his wire-rimmed glasses. Are you certain you want to take on this level of financial complexity? Perhaps a simple trust or some conservative investments would be more appropriate for someone in your situation. Someone in my situation. Even James, with his Harvard law degree and 40 years of experience, had initially seen exactly what I wanted him to see: a grieving widow in over her head. It had taken 3 meetings and a detailed presentation of my investment strategy before he'd realized that the quiet woman in the cardigan understood compound interest. property valuation, and market timing better than most of his younger clients. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The truth was, I'd been Harold's secret partner in building our fortune long before I knew we had one. While he'd made the final investment decisions, I'd been the one researching companies, analyzing market trends, and identifying opportunities. Harold would come home from his shift at the machine shop and find me at the kitchen table with newspapers spread out, tracking stock performances and reading annual reports I'd requested from companies that caught my attention. "You've got a mind for this, Betty," he'd tell me, reviewing my notes and recommendations. "Maybe in another lifetime you'd have been running Wall Street instead of running our household." But this was our lifetime, and in 1965, when we'd married, women didn't run Wall Street. They ran households, supported their husbands, and made the best of whatever opportunities were available. I'd channeled my analytical mind into finding the best deals at the grocery store, stretching Harold's machinist salary and creating a home where every dollar was maximized. What I hadn't realized was that Harold was taking my research and recommendations and quietly building an investment portfolio that would eventually fund the life I was living now. The morning after Harold's funeral, when I'd finally opened that safety deposit box, I'd found not just investment documents but letters, dozens of them, written in Harold's careful script, documenting every decision he'd made based on my insights. Stock purchases I'd suggested that had split multiple times. Real estate observations I'd made that had led to profitable acquisitions. Companies I'd identified as undervalued that had eventually been acquired at significant premiums. "Betty sees things before other people do," one letter read. She told me in 1978 that computers were going to change everything, and that we should invest in the companies making them smaller and more affordable. She was watching Wang Laboratories and Digital Equipment Corporation before anyone was talking about personal computers. Betty's instincts about technology, about changing demographics, about where people want to live and work, they're better than any financial advisor we could hire. Reading those letters had been like discovering a conversation I'd been having with Harold for decades without realizing it. Every casual observation I'd made about a growing company, every suggestion about a neighborhood that seemed to be improving, every insight about changing consumer behavior, Harold had been listening, evaluating, and acting on my unconscious expertise. So when James Whitmore finally understood that I wasn't a widow who'd stumbled into wealth but a woman who'd been building it for years without knowing it, our relationship changed completely. Within 6 months, we'd established Morrison Properties, LLC, with me as the sole owner and a management company handling the day-to-day operations that would have revealed my involvement to my family. The first purchase had been Michael and Rebecca's house. They'd been renting a cramped apartment in Medford, desperately saving for a down payment they couldn't quite reach while Rebecca was on maternity leave with Tyler. I'd approached them through the management company, offering an owner-financed arrangement that required a smaller down payment and carried a below-market interest rate. Michael had been so proud when he'd called to tell me they'd finally become homeowners, so grateful for the lucky break that had made it possible. The second purchase had been Tyler's apartment building near BU, not because he needed help. His parents were covering his housing costs, but because I'd recognized the investment potential in a well-maintained building near a major university. The fact that it kept Tyler's rent reasonable while building equity was simply a bonus. The third had been the office building where Rebecca worked, a small but well-located property in Newton that had been undervalued due to deferred maintenance. I'd bought it, upgraded the electrical and HVAC systems, and watched both the property value and rental income increase significantly. Rebecca had mentioned to Michael how much she liked the new management company that had taken over, how responsive they were to tenant concerns, and how much the building improvements had made her workplace more comfortable. Each purchase had been strategically sound, independent of any family connection. I wasn't making charity investments. I was building a portfolio that would provide long-term security while happening to benefit the people I loved most. Harold would have been proud of the approach, generous but not foolish, protective but not controlling. But sitting at that Thanksgiving table, listening to Tyler lecture me about fiscal responsibility while eating turkey in a house I owned, I realized that my careful secrecy had created a blind spot I hadn't anticipated. My family didn't just misunderstand my financial situation, they actively pitied it. And that was about to change. The story of how Harold and I built our fortune began in 1967, 2 years after we'd married, when I made an observation that would change our lives forever. We were living in a tiny apartment above Kowalski's hardware store on Main Street in Springfield, and Harold was walking to his job at American Bosch every morning, coming home with grease under his fingernails and stories about the precision machinery he was helping to build. I was working part-time at the Springfield Public Library, a job that paid almost nothing but gave me access to something more valuable than money: information. Every day I'd process newspapers from Boston, New York, and even some from California, and I'd begun to notice patterns in the business sections that nobody else seemed to be discussing. "Harold," I'd said one evening as he sat at our small kitchen table, carefully cleaning his hands with the pumice soap he always used, "have you noticed how many companies are starting to mention computers in their annual reports?" He'd looked up from his hands, one eyebrow raised in the way that meant he was genuinely interested in what I was thinking. "Computers? You mean those room-sized things at the insurance companies?" "That's just it," I'd said, spreading out clippings I'd been saving. "Look at this article from the Boston Globe about a company called Digital Equipment Corporation. They're making computers that are smaller, still big, but not room-sized. And this piece from the Wall Street Journal about something called integrated circuits that are going to make electronics even smaller and cheaper." Harold had studied the articles with the same careful attention he brought to reading blueprint specifications at work. "What are you thinking, Betty?" "I'm thinking that if computers are getting smaller and cheaper, more companies are going to want them. And if more companies want them, the companies making them are going to grow. Fast." It wasn't a sophisticated analysis by today's standards, but in 1967, it was prescient. Harold had taken $50 from our meager savings account, money we'd been setting aside for a washing machine, and bought 2 shares of Digital Equipment Corporation stock at $25 per share. I'd researched the company for months, reading everything I could find about their PDP-8 computer and their plans for expansion. That $50 investment would split multiple times over the next decade, and by 1980, it had grown to over $8,000. But more importantly, it had established a pattern that would define our financial strategy for the next 40 years. I would research and analyze. Harold would make the actual purchases and manage the paperwork, and we would reinvest our gains, rather than improving our lifestyle. The second major breakthrough had come in 1972, when I'd noticed something that seemed obvious in retrospect, but wasn't being discussed in any of the financial publications I read. "Harold," I'd said one Sunday morning as we drove through the suburbs of West Springfield, "look at all these young families moving out here. Look at how many new houses are being built." "It's the baby boom kids growing up," Harold had observed. "Getting married, starting families of their own." "Exactly. And where are they going to shop?" "The downtown stores are too far away, and they all have cars now. Someone's going to build shopping centers out here, close to where people live." I'd spent weeks walking through the suburbs, identifying large parcels of undeveloped land near growing residential areas. Harold and I would drive out on weekends, and I'd point out locations that seemed perfect for retail development: easy highway access, visible from main roads, surrounded by new housing developments. When we'd saved enough money, Harold had approached the owner of a 15-acre parcel on Boston Road in Wilbraham, about 10 minutes from the new subdivisions being built there. The farmer who owned it was getting older and tired of worrying about property taxes on land he wasn't farming anymore. Harold had offered him $25,000, nearly every penny we'd saved from our investments and careful living, for the entire parcel. You sure about this, Harold? The farmer had asked. It's just empty land, nothing but grass and a few trees. My wife thinks someone's going to want to build a shopping center here someday, Harold had replied. And my wife is usually right about these things. 5 years later, a development company had approached us about purchasing the land for exactly that purpose. They'd built Wilbraham Plaza, anchored by a stop-and-shop supermarket and featuring 12 smaller retail spaces. The sale had netted us $420,000, a fortune by our standards, but money we'd immediately reinvested in 3 smaller properties and a diversified stock portfolio. By 1980, we'd established our pattern completely. I would identify opportunities, undervalued stocks, properties in areas poised for growth, demographic trends that would create new markets. Harold would research the legal and financial mechanics of each investment, then execute the transactions through accounts and partnerships that kept our names out of public records. We'd live modestly, reinvest aggressively, and never discuss our growing wealth with anyone, including our son Michael. The secrecy hadn't been about shame or fear. It had been about values. We'd both grown up during the Depression, had seen how sudden wealth could corrupt people, could make them lazy or entitled or careless with relationships that mattered more than money. We'd wanted Michael to develop his own work ethic, his own sense of responsibility, his own relationship with money that wasn't distorted by knowing he had wealthy parents. When Michael had graduated from college and started his career as an electrical engineer, we'd been proud that he'd chosen a profession based on his interests and abilities, not because he felt pressure to earn a certain income or maintain a certain lifestyle. When he'd married Rebecca and they'd struggled to afford their first apartment, we'd watched them learn to budget and prioritize and make sacrifices together, experiences that would serve them well regardless of their financial circumstances. But we'd also been prepared to help if they'd ever faced a genuine crisis. Harold had established emergency funds and contingency plans that could have supported Michael's family through job loss, medical emergencies, or economic downturns without them ever knowing where the assistance was coming from. The goal, Harold had explained to me during one of our monthly investment reviews, is to give them security without giving them dependence, safety without taking away their motivation to build their own lives. It had been a delicate balance, and for nearly 40 years we'd maintained it successfully, until Harold's death had left me holding all the pieces of a financial empire our family didn't know existed. The first time I noticed the shift in how my family treated me was at Michael's 40th birthday party, 6 months after Harold's funeral. Rebecca had organized a small gathering at their house, the house I now owned, but they believed they were still paying a mortgage on. And I'd arrived with a modest gift and a homemade cake, just as I always had. Mom, you shouldn't have gone. To the trouble of baking, Michael had said, accepting the cake with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We could have picked something up from the grocery store. It was such a small comment, so seemingly innocent, but it carried an undertone I'd never heard before. The implication that my efforts were somehow unnecessary, perhaps even burdensome. That store-bought would have been easier for everyone involved. Tyler, then 19 and home from his sophomore year at UMass, had been more direct. Grandma Betty, why don't you just buy cakes now? Aren't you tired of all that work? I enjoy baking, I'd replied simply. It's not work when you enjoy it. But you're getting older, Tyler had continued with the brutal honesty of youth. Maybe it's time to start taking it easier, Save your energy for more important things. More important than celebrating my son's birthday with something made with love rather than purchased with money? I'd wanted to ask, but I'd held my tongue. Tyler was young, focused on his business studies, thinking in terms of efficiency and resource allocation. He didn't understand that the cake wasn't about the cake, it was about the tradition, the care, the connection to a lifetime of family celebrations. But that conversation had planted a seed of awareness that grew over the following months. Suddenly, I was noticing comments that might have passed without attention before. Rebecca mentioning to a neighbor that they were keeping an eye on Michael's mother, since she was getting up there in years. Michael suggesting that I might want to consider giving up my driver's license before something happens. Tyler offering to help me with my computer problems when I mentioned checking my email, not understanding that I'd been using computers since before he was born. The pattern became clearer at every family gathering. When I offered to bring dishes to potluck dinners, Rebecca would suggest I just bring rolls from the bakery instead. When I mentioned wanting to attend Tyler's college graduation, Michael asked if I was sure I was up for all that traveling and walking. When Emma, Tyler's younger sister, started college and I mentioned wanting to visit her campus, the family exchanged glances that clearly said, "Should we really let Grandma drive 2 hours by herself?" The irony was exquisite. While they were questioning my ability to drive to Emma's college, I was in the process of purchasing a small apartment complex 3 blocks from her dormitory. While they worried about whether I could handle the stress of holiday cooking, I was reviewing architectural plans for a major renovation of the office building where Rebecca worked. While Tyler expressed concern about my fixed income, I was earning more in quarterly dividends than his father made in a year. The breaking point came 18 months after Harold's death, during what should have been a routine family dinner. I'd arrived at their house, my house, carrying a casserole dish, and wearing the simple navy dress and cardigan that had become my uniform for family gatherings. Rebecca had answered the door with a strained smile. "Elizabeth, we need to talk," she'd said, using my full name in the way that meant trouble was coming. "Michael and I have been discussing your situation, and we're concerned my situation," as if being a financially independent widow who owned more property than anyone at that table was a problem to be solved. We'd sat in their living room, the living room I'd helped finance, with furniture they'd purchased using the extra money from their below-market mortgage payments, while Michael and Rebecca explained their concerns. I was living alone. I was getting older. The assisted living facility was expensive, and while they understood I had some savings from Harold's pension, they worried about what would happen when that money ran out. "We've been thinking," Michael had said, his voice taking on the careful tone one uses with someone whose feelings need to be managed. "Maybe it would be better if you moved into something smaller. More affordable. There's a lovely senior housing complex in Chicopee that has income-based rent. Very reasonable. Income-based rent. They wanted me to move into subsidized housing. And we want you to know," Rebecca had added quickly, "that we're prepared to help. Not with money. We're still stretched pretty thin with the mortgage and the kids' expenses. But we could help you pack, help you navigate the application process. Make sure you get all the services you're entitled to." Services. I was entitled to, like food stamps and Medicare supplemental insurance and heating assistance for low-income seniors. I'd sat there listening to them plan my descent into genteel poverty, all while surrounded by improvements I'd funded. The hardwood floors they'd refinished last year, paid for with the cushion their below-market mortgage provided, the new refrigerator in the kitchen, purchased with money they'd saved because their landlord never raised their property taxes or insurance costs to market rates. Tyler had been the worst, though. When he'd come home for spring break a month later, he'd taken it upon himself to give me a lecture about realistic financial planning for seniors. "Grandma Betty," he'd said, settling beside me on the couch with the patronizing patience of someone who'd just finished his first semester of finance classes. "I know nobody wants to talk about money, but we need to be practical about your future." He'd actually brought charts, printed charts showing average life expectancy, average costs of elder care, and average Social Security benefits. He'd walked me through a financial reality assessment that demonstrated how my current lifestyle was unsustainable and how family members might need to step in to help when my resources were exhausted. "The good news," he'd concluded, "is that you're still young enough to make smart choices. If you downsize now, budget carefully, and maybe take advantage of some of the programs available for seniors, you can maintain your independence for several more years. Several more years. As if my independence was a finite resource that needed to be rationed carefully, rather than a choice I was making from a position of strength. But the comment that had really crystallized everything came from Emma. Sweet, 18-year-old Emma, during a phone conversation about her college plans. "I feel bad about the tuition costs," she'd said. "I know it's hard on Mom and Dad, and I worry about what it means for taking care of you later, Grandma Betty. Maybe I should look at community college for the first 2 years to save money, taking care of me later." My own granddaughter was already factoring the burden of my future care into her educational decisions, sacrificing her opportunities to prepare for obligations that didn't exist. That was when I realized that my well-intentioned secrecy had created something I'd never intended, a family that saw me not as the capable, independent woman I was, but as a slowly declining responsibility they needed to manage with increasingly gentle control. The breaking point began building 3 months before that devastating Thanksgiving dinner, when Tyler graduated from business school and moved back to Boston to start his new job at a financial consulting firm. Suddenly, he was the family expert on everything money-related, and I became his primary project. "Grandma Betty," he'd announced during his first Sunday dinner back home, "I've been thinking about your financial portfolio, and I'd like to help you optimize it." Financial portfolio. He assumed I had one worth optimizing rather than understanding, that I was optimizing his family's financial situation from behind the scenes. "That's very thoughtful, Tyler," I'd replied carefully. "But I'm quite comfortable with my current arrangements." His expression had shifted into what I was beginning to recognize as his professional concern face, the look he'd probably learned in business school for dealing with clients who didn't understand their own best interests. "I know change can be scary," he'd said, his voice taking on the patient tone he might use with a confused elderly client. "But that's exactly why you need someone with current knowledge to help you. Financial markets are complicated now. It's not like when you and Grandpa were young. Not like when Harold and I were building the very portfolio Tyler's family was unknowingly benefiting from every month." The interventions escalated quickly after that. Tyler had somehow convinced Michael and Rebecca that I needed family financial oversight, and suddenly every conversation became an opportunity to discuss my supposed limitations. When I mentioned wanting to replace my 10-year-old Honda Civic, Michael immediately suggested I look at used cars instead of new ones. "At your age, Mom, it doesn't make sense to tie up money in a depreciating asset," he'd said. "Tyler found some great deals on certified pre-owned vehicles that would be much more practical for your budget." When I'd mentioned that the air conditioning in my apartment at Sunset Manor was acting up, Rebecca had immediately launched into a speech about how I shouldn't expect the management to fix things quickly, since assisted living facilities knew their residents were captive customers with limited options. "You might want to start keeping records of maintenance issues," she'd advised. "Sometimes these places take advantage of older residents who don't want to make waves." The assumption that I wouldn't advocate for myself, that I'd accept poor service, because I was old and financially vulnerable, stung more than she could have known. What Rebecca didn't realize was that I'd already spoken to the property manager about the air conditioning issue, not as a complaining tenant, but as someone whose property management company had recommended Sunset Manor to several clients and wanted to ensure they maintained appropriate standards. But Tyler's campaign reached new heights when he decided to help me with my healthcare planning. He'd arrived at my apartment one Saturday morning with a briefcase full of pamphlets about Medicare Advantage plans, supplemental insurance options, and something called catastrophic care planning for seniors on fixed incomes. "I've been researching this for weeks," he'd announced, spreading materials across my small dining table. "Most people your age don't realize how much medical costs can impact their financial security. We need to get you set up with the right protections before something happens. Before something happens. As if my health and my finances were ticking. Time bombs that required his urgent intervention. He'd spent 2 hours walking me through scenarios where various medical emergencies would exhaust my resources and explaining how proper planning could preserve family assets when I eventually needed long-term care. The entire presentation was based on the assumption that I had maybe $50,000 in savings and a Social Security check barely covering my current expenses. The key, Tyler had explained with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just discovered fire, is to spend down your assets strategically so you can qualify for Medicaid when you need nursing home care. Otherwise, you'll be private pay for however long your money lasts, and then the family will be stuck with the bills. My own grandson was planning for my financial demise and calculating how to minimize the burden on himself and his parents. But the most painful moment had come when Tyler had suggested I consider signing financial power of attorney over to Michael, just in case. Not because we don't trust you to make good decisions now, he'd said quickly, seeing my expression. But cognitive decline can happen gradually, and sometimes people don't recognize when they're not thinking as clearly as they used to. Having Dad as your financial power of attorney would protect you from making any mistakes that could hurt your security. Protect me from making mistakes. While I was sitting there owning the building where his mother worked, the house his family lived in, and generating more passive income than his new consulting job would pay him in his first 5 years. The final straw had been his offer to help me understand the paperwork from my investment accounts. He'd assumed I had a simple savings account and maybe a small CD from the local bank, and he wanted to review my statements to make sure I wasn't being charged inappropriate fees. A lot of banks take advantage of senior customers, he'd explained earnestly. They know older people don't always understand the new fee structures or digital banking requirements. I can help you switch to a bank that offers better services for people in your situation. People in my situation. Senior citizens who needed protection from predatory financial institutions rather than senior citizens who owned stock in several banks and served on investment committees for local nonprofits. That was when I realized that Tyler's graduation from business school hadn't just made him the family financial expert, it had made him confident that he understood money better than anyone else in the family, especially his elderly grandmother who obviously needed his guidance to avoid financial catastrophe. The irony was devastating. Here was my grandson, offering to protect me from financial institutions while I was earning more from my portfolio than his entire family's combined income, lecturing me about asset preservation while living in a house I'd purchased to preserve his family's assets. The week before Thanksgiving, Tyler had called me with what he described as exciting news about my future living arrangements. He'd been researching senior housing options and had found what he called the perfect solution for my financial situation. "Grandma Betty, you're going to love this," he'd said, his voice bubbling with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just solved a complex problem. I found a HUD-subsidized senior community in West Springfield that has everything you need: income-based rent, on-site medical services, transportation to shopping and appointments, even a community dining room so you wouldn't have to worry about cooking every day. Income-based rent. My grandson wanted me to apply for government housing assistance. They have a waiting list, he'd continued, apparently interpreting my silence as interest rather than shock. But I've already talked to the housing coordinator about your situation. She thinks you'd qualify easily, and she's willing to expedite your application because of your age and current housing costs. My current housing costs at Sunset Manor, which I could afford indefinitely without touching my principal, were apparently evidence of financial distress rather than personal choice. "Tyler," I'd said carefully, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm quite comfortable where I am." "I know change is hard," he'd replied in that patient tone again, "but we have to be realistic about sustainability. Mom and Dad ran the numbers, and at the rate you're spending on rent and utilities, you'll exhaust your savings within 3 years. This HUD place would cut your housing costs by more than half." Mom and Dad ran the numbers. My own son and daughter-in-law were calculating my descent into poverty based on assumptions that were so completely wrong, they would have been funny if they weren't so heartbreaking. We're having a family meeting about it after Thanksgiving. Dinner, Tyler had announced. Dad wants to discuss the transition timeline and figure out how we can help with the application process. Emma's really excited about the volunteer opportunities there. Apparently, they have a program where college students can earn community service credits, helping seniors with computer skills and stuff like that. A family meeting about my future. Without consulting me about whether I wanted their help or even whether I needed it. But the truly devastating part was learning that Emma was already planning to volunteer at the facility where they intended to relocate me. My sweet granddaughter, who was struggling to pay for college while worrying about becoming a burden to her family, was prepared to spend her free time teaching computer skills to her own grandmother because everyone assumed I was too old and poor to understand technology. The Thanksgiving invitation itself had carried undertones I'd never heard before. When Rebecca had called to confirm dinner plans, she'd made a point of mentioning that they'd arranged everything so I wouldn't have to worry about contributing anything. Just bring yourself, she'd said. We know the holidays can be stressful. When you're on a tight budget, so we want you to just relax and enjoy being with family. Being on a tight budget, they'd decided that my presence at family gatherings was now a financial strain that required their careful management. When I'd arrived that Thanksgiving morning, carrying the green bean casserole I'd been bringing to family dinners for over 20 years, Rebecca's reaction had been immediate and telling. "Oh, Elizabeth, you shouldn't have," she'd said, accepting the dish with a strained smile. "I told you we had everything covered." But it was Tyler's reaction that had really prepared me for what was coming. He'd emerged from the kitchen with an expression of barely concealed frustration, clearly having expected me to follow their instructions about not contributing to the meal. "Grandma Betty, we talked about this," he'd said. "You don't need to keep spending money on ingredients and taking time to cook when we've got everything handled. It's not efficient for anyone." Not efficient. My contribution to family traditions was now being evaluated based on economic efficiency rather than love or connection or the simple pleasure of sharing something I'd made with people I cared about. As I'd handed the casserole to Rebecca and watched Tyler shake his head in exasperation, I'd realized that this Thanksgiving dinner wasn't going to be a normal family gathering. It was going to be an intervention. They'd planned to use the occasion, with extended family present as witnesses and supporters, to convince me to accept their version of what my life should become. The dining room had been set for 23 people, including Rebecca's parents, her sister's family, and what Tyler had described as some close family friends who were joining us for dinner. I'd assumed it was just Rebecca's way of making the holiday feel more festive, but as I'd watched the seating arrangements being finalized, I'd begun to understand the real purpose. I'd been seated not at my usual place near Michael, but at the far end of the table, between Rebecca's elderly Aunt Margaret and Tyler's girlfriend Sarah. It was the position reserved for honored but slightly peripheral guests, people who needed to be included but didn't require close attention. The conversation. Topics had been carefully managed, too. Every time I'd tried to contribute to discussions about current events or family plans, someone had gently redirected the conversation or asked me about my health, my activities at Sunset Manor, or whether I was keeping warm enough in my apartment. By the time we'd sat down for dinner, I'd realized that the entire gathering had been orchestrated as a setting for Tyler's announcement about my housing situation. The large group provided witnesses to my family's concern and generosity. The formal setting gave weight to their intervention, and my placement at the table ensured that when Tyler delivered his prepared remarks about my need for more appropriate living arrangements, I'd be surrounded by people who would nod approvingly at his mature handling of a difficult family situation. The moment arrived just as we were finishing the main course. Tyler had been building up to it all evening, making pointed comments about family responsibilities and realistic planning for the future. Rebecca's sister had been nodding knowingly, clearly briefed in advance about the intervention they had planned. "Before we move on to dessert," Tyler announced, standing up and clearing his throat in a way that commanded attention from the entire table. "I think this is a good time to discuss something important that affects our whole family." The conversations around the table died away. Even the children in the adjacent room seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere and quieted their chatter. Tyler looked directly at me, his expression a mixture of determination and what he probably thought was compassionate authority. "Grandma Betty," he began, his voice taking on the formal tone he'd learned in business school presentations, "we've all been concerned about your living situation for a while now, and we think it's time to have an honest conversation about making some changes that would be better for everyone. Better for everyone. Not better for me, but better for everyone, including the family members who were apparently being burdened by my continued independence." "As you know," Tyler continued, clearly working from mental notes he'd prepared, "assisted living costs are rising faster than inflation, and on a fixed income, that kind of expense just isn't sustainable long term. We've been researching alternatives that would give you the same level of support while being much more economically responsible. Economically responsible. My financial choices were being evaluated by a 24-year-old who'd just started his first real job and was living in an apartment building I owned." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but didn't interrupt. Rebecca was nodding supportively, playing her role in this carefully orchestrated intervention. The extended family members were listening with the serious expressions people adopt when witnessing someone else's family handle a difficult situation, with grace and maturity. "The HUD senior community I told you about has an opening coming up in January," Tyler announced, as if this were wonderful news. "They're willing to fast-track your application because of your age and current housing costs. The rent would be based on your income, which means you'd pay about 30% of what you're paying now." 30% of what I was paying now for housing I could afford indefinitely. The mathematics of my supposed poverty had been calculated and presented as if Tyler were announcing a scholarship I'd won rather than charity I needed. "I know change can be scary at any age," Tyler continued, his voice warming with what he clearly believed was empathy, "but this would really be the smart move financially. It would stretch your savings for years longer, and it would give the whole family peace of mind knowing you're in a place designed specifically for people in your situation. People in my situation. Senior citizens who needed government assistance to afford basic housing." I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart breaking exactly, but something harder and more fundamental. The careful patience I'd maintained for months, the gentle tolerance for their misguided concern, the willingness to let them believe they were protecting me while I was actually protecting them. "Tyler," I said quietly, my voice cutting through his practiced presentation, "what exactly do you think my situation is?" He blinked, clearly not having expected the question. "Well, I mean, you're on a fixed income, and assisted living is expensive, and we just want to make sure you're not—" "Not what?" I interrupted, my voice still quiet, but carrying a new edge that made several people at the table shift uncomfortably. "Not putting yourself in a position where you might become a financial burden on the family," Tyler said, apparently deciding that directness was his best strategy. "We love you, Grandma Betty, but we have to be realistic about resources. Dad and Mom are still paying their mortgage, Emma's college costs are increasing every year, and I'm just starting my career. We want to help you, but we can't take on additional financial responsibilities right now." Additional financial responsibilities. The family I'd been quietly supporting for years was worried about me becoming a drain on resources I was actually providing. "So what you're saying," I said, rising slowly from my chair and looking directly at Tyler, "is that you think I'm a burden? Maybe it's time I accepted that. Is that right?" "That's not," Tyler began, but I held up my hand. "No, let's be clear about this. You've brought 23 people together on Thanksgiving to tell me that my independence is too expensive. My choices are unrealistic. And my future needs to be managed by people who understand money better than I do. You want me to apply for government housing assistance and accept that I can't afford to maintain my current lifestyle? Is that an accurate summary? Tyler's face flushed, but his jaw set with determination. Grandma Betty, I know this is hard to hear, but yes. You're 78 years old. You're living on Social Security and whatever savings Grandpa left, and you're spending money like you're still working. We're trying to help you before you end up with nothing. You're just a burden, Grandma Betty, he said, the words coming out harder than he'd probably intended. Maybe it's time you accepted that. The silence that followed was absolute. 23 people sitting in a house I owned, eating a meal served on china I'd helped them afford, staring at the woman they believed needed their charity while she controlled assets they couldn't imagine. The word burden hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had finally consumed everything combustible in the room. I looked around the table at faces frozen in shock, some horrified by Tyler's bluntness, others nodding in uncomfortable agreement with his assessment. Michael's mouth was slightly open, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the Rebecca was staring at her plate, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment at how far Tyler had gone with his intervention. But it was Emma's expression that cut deepest. My sweet granddaughter was looking at me with such profound pity, such genuine sadness for my situation, that I realized she'd been carrying the weight of my supposed financial struggles for months. This 18-year-old girl, worrying about college costs and part-time jobs, had been losing sleep over how her family would eventually afford to take care of her impoverished grandmother. I stood up slowly, carefully placing my napkin beside my plate, the same bone china plates Harold and I had given Michael and Rebecca for their wedding anniversary 5 years ago. The same dining room where we'd celebrated Tyler's graduation from high school, Emma's acceptance to college, Michael's promotion to senior engineer. Thank you for dinner, Rebecca, I said, my voice perfectly steady despite the storm building inside my chest. It was lovely, as always. Grandma Betty, please don't, Emma started, but I held up my hand gently. I think it's best if I go now, I continued, moving around the table to collect my purse and coat. This conversation has been very illuminating. Tyler's girlfriend Sarah was staring at her hands, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Rebecca's parents were exchanging glances that suggested they were reconsidering their opinion of their daughters-in-laws. The carefully orchestrated intervention had become exactly what Tyler hadn't wanted it to become, a public humiliation that reflected poorly on everyone involved. Mom, please sit down. Michael finally found his voice. Tyler didn't mean it the way it sounded. I paused at the doorway to the dining room and looked back at my son. Didn't he? Because it sounded very much like he's been thinking about this for quite some time, like you all have. The drive back to Sunset Manor was a blur of streetlights and stop signs, my hands gripping the steering wheel of my 10-year-old Honda, while my mind raced through everything that had just happened. Not just Tyler's words, but the careful planning behind them. The guest list designed to provide supportive witnesses. The seating arrangement that positioned me as the object of family concern rather than a participating family member. The practiced presentation about housing options that had clearly been researched and discussed extensively before tonight. They hadn't just decided I was a burden. They'd been planning how to manage that burden for months. When I reached my apartment, I sat in my car for several minutes, staring up at the building that Tyler thought was draining my non-existent savings account. The same building where I'd chosen to live not because I couldn't afford better, but because I valued the community, the convenient location, and the freedom from home maintenance responsibilities that allowed me to focus on managing my investments. Inside my small apartment, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where I'd spent countless evenings over the past 5 years, reviewing property reports, analyzing market trends, and making the decisions that had built the empire my family didn't know existed. The folder containing my quarterly investment statements was right there in the drawer where it had always been, along with property deeds, insurance policies, and bank account information that would have answered every question Tyler had raised about my financial sustainability. For 5 years, I'd protected them from the knowledge of my wealth because I'd believed it would preserve their independence, their work ethic, their authentic relationships with me. I'd wanted them to see me as Betty Morrison the person, not Betty Morrison the property owner. I'd wanted their love and respect to be based on who I was, not what I owned. But sitting in my apartment after being told by my own grandson that I was a burden who needed to accept government housing assistance, I realized that my protective secrecy had accomplished exactly the opposite of what I'd intended. Instead of preserving authentic relationships, it had created relationships based on fundamental misunderstandings. Instead of protecting their independence, it had made them feel responsible for my dependence. Instead of being seen as a whole person, I was being seen as a problem to be solved. The decision crystallized with startling clarity. Tomorrow, I would call James Whitmore and ask him to prepare documentation that would make my financial situation completely transparent. Not because I wanted to punish Tyler for his cruel words, but because I was finally ready to stop living a lie that was hurting everyone involved. I'd spent 5 years protecting my family from the truth about my wealth. Now it was time to protect myself from their assumptions about my poverty. It was time to set the record straight, whatever the consequences might be. The following Saturday, I invited the family for dinner at my apartment. All of them, including Tyler's girlfriend, Sarah, and Rebecca's parents. I have something important to discuss with everyone, I'd told Michael when I called. Something that affects the whole family. James Whitmore had worked quickly to prepare the documentation I'd requested. Property deeds, financial statements, investment portfolios, and a detailed summary of Morrison Properties LLC sat in neat folders on my small dining table, waiting for the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating for 5 years. They arrived looking like people attending a funeral, somber, uncomfortable, clearly expecting another difficult conversation about my housing situation or medical care or financial limitations. Tyler carried himself with the stiff posture of someone who'd been lectured by his parents about being more sensitive in his approach, but I could see the determination in his eyes. He believed he was right about my situation, and a week of family pressure hadn't changed his fundamental assessment. "Thank you all for coming," I said once everyone had gathered in my small living room. "I know last week was difficult for everyone, but I've realized that we need to have a different kind of conversation, one based on complete honesty rather than assumptions." Michael shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "Mom, if this is about what Tyler said—" "This is about what Tyler said," I interrupted gently. "But not in the way you might think. Tyler, you said I was a burden who needed to accept government housing assistance because my current lifestyle isn't financially sustainable. Is that still your assessment?" Tyler's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Grandma Betty, I know you're upset, but the numbers don't lie. Assisted living costs versus Social Security benefits and limited savings. It's basic mathematics." "You're absolutely right," I agreed, moving to the dining table and picking up the first folder. "It is basic mathematics. So let's look at some actual numbers." I handed him the property deed for his parents' house. "This is the deed for your family's home. Note the owner's name at the bottom." Tyler's eyes scanned the document, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Elizabeth M. Morrison. But this says that I own the house you've been living in for 11 years, I confirmed. "The mortgage payments your parents have been making? They go to an account I control." Rebecca's face had gone completely white. "That's impossible. We bought that house from Morrison Properties LLC, which is wholly owned by me," I said, handing her the corporate filing documents. "The below-market interest rate, the flexible payment terms, the fact that your property taxes never seem to increase. All of that was my doing." I turned to Tyler, whose hands were shaking as he stared at the deed. "The apartment building where you lived during college? I bought that too. I handed him another deed. Your rent was reasonable because I kept it that way. The room had gone, completely silent except for the sound of papers rustling as I distributed document after document. Investment statements showing a portfolio worth over $12 million. Property deeds for 7 buildings across Massachusetts. Bank statements that made Tyler's starting salary look like pocket change. This is impossible, Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible. You can't. How could you? Have $12 million while living like I'm on food stamps? I finished gently. That was a choice, Tyler. Just like helping your family was a choice. Just like listening to you lecture me about financial responsibility while you sat in a house I own was a choice. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Tyler stared at the documents spread across his lap as if they were written in a foreign language. Rebecca kept picking up different property deeds, reading them, then setting them down and picking up others, as though repetition would somehow change what they said. I don't understand, Michael finally said, his voice hollow. All these years, when we worried about your finances, when we talked about helping you with expenses, you were never helping me with expenses, I said quietly. I was helping you with yours. The house, Tyler's apartment building, the office complex where Rebecca works. I've owned all of it for years. Rebecca's head snapped up. My office building? The one on Commonwealth Avenue? I nodded. I bought it 3 years ago when it was undervalued due to maintenance issues. The improvements you've mentioned, the new HVAC system, the updated security, the renovated lobby, those were my investments. Tyler's face had gone through several color changes, finally settling on a grayish pallor that made him look ill. But you live in assisted living. You drive an old car. You clip coupons. Because I choose to, I replied. Because material. Possessions have never been how Harold and I measured success. Because I believe in living below my means, not flaunting wealth unnecessarily. Sarah, Tyler's girlfriend, spoke for the first time since arriving. Mrs. Morrison, I don't understand. If you could afford anything you wanted, why did you let them think you were struggling? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for days. Because I wanted them to see me as Betty Morrison the person, not Betty Morrison the bank account. I wanted their concern to be genuine, their relationships with me to be authentic. Authentic? Tyler's voice cracked slightly. There's nothing authentic about lying to your family for 5 years. I never lied, I said firmly. I simply didn't volunteer information you never asked for. When did any of you ever ask about my actual financial situation? You made assumptions based on appearances and lifestyle choices, then treated those assumptions as facts. Michael stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. This changes everything. Every conversation we've had about your future, every plan we've made. Every plan you've made without consulting me, I corrected. The HUD housing Tyler researched, the family meetings about my care, the discussions about my sustainability, all of that was based on decisions you made about what my life should look like. Tyler crumpled the deed he was holding, then immediately smoothed it out again, as if damaging the document might somehow undo its contents. We were trying to help you. Were you? Or were you trying to manage what you perceived as a problem? There's a difference between helping someone who asks for assistance and reorganizing someone's life because you've decided they can't handle it themselves. Rebecca was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. We thought we were being responsible, taking care of family. You were taking care of family, I acknowledged gently, but you were taking care of a version of me that didn't exist. The struggling widow who needed your guidance and protection. That wasn't me. That was a character you created because it was easier to manage than the reality of who I actually am. The weight of that realization settled over the room like dust after an explosion. The weeks that followed the revelation were some of the most difficult our family had ever experienced. Tyler didn't speak to me for almost a month, his embarrassment so profound that he couldn't bring himself to return my phone calls. When he finally did call, his voice was small and unfamiliar. "Grandma Betty," he said, "I need to apologize. Not just for calling you a burden, but for everything. For assuming I knew better than you about your own life. For treating you like you were incompetent when you were actually taking care of all of us." It wasn't a perfect apology. There was still a hint of wounded pride in his voice, a suggestion that I should have corrected his assumptions earlier. But it was genuine, and that was enough to start rebuilding. Michael took a different approach. He appeared at my apartment the following Tuesday with a bottle of wine and a look of profound confusion. "Mom," he said as I poured 2 glasses, "I need to understand something. All those times I offered to help with your bills, all those conversations. About your budget? Were you laughing at me?" "I was never laughing," I assured him. "I was touched that you wanted to help, even when help wasn't needed. But I was also frustrated that you couldn't imagine a version of me that was capable and independent." He was quiet for a long time, staring into his wine glass. "I think I needed you to need me," he admitted finally. "After Dad died, I felt like I had to step into his role as the family protector. Having a mother who didn't need protection made me feel unnecessary." It was an insight that explained so much about the past 5 years. Michael's increasing attempts to manage my decisions, his discomfort with my independence, his relief when Tyler took over the role of family financial expert. Rebecca's reaction was perhaps the most honest. She came to see me alone, without Michael or the children, and sat in my living room, looking like someone who'd discovered that gravity worked in reverse. "I'm embarrassed," she said simply. "Not just about the money, but about how we talked about you, behind your back, planning your life like you weren't capable of planning it yourself. I'm embarrassed about who we became when we thought we had power over someone vulnerable." Her honesty was devastating and healing at the same time. "We all become different versions of ourselves when we think we're helping someone weaker," I replied. "The question is what we do with that knowledge now." The real change came gradually, in small gestures that showed they were beginning to see me differently. Tyler started asking for my investment advice instead of offering to manage my portfolio. Michael began consulting me about major decisions instead of informing me about them afterward. Rebecca stopped explaining things to me as if I were a child who needed simplified information. But the moment I knew we were truly healing came when Emma called me from college with an idea. "Grandma Betty," she said, her voice bright with excitement, "I've been thinking about what you said about using money as a tool. What if we started a scholarship fund for first-generation college students? You could teach me about investing, and we could grow it together." For the first time in months, someone was asking me to be a partner rather than a patient. 6 months later, we gathered again for Thanksgiving, this time at the beach house in Cape Cod that I'd purchased 2 years earlier, but never mentioned to anyone. The same house where Tyler now brought his laptop on weekends to work on the business plan for our joint venture. Morrison Family Scholarships, a foundation that would support first-generation college students pursuing careers in engineering and business. "The applications are incredible," Emma said, reviewing folders spread across the dining table that overlooked Nantucket Sound. "These students have overcome so much just to get to college." Tyler nodded, his entire demeanor transformed from the entitled young man who'd lectured me about financial responsibility 6 months earlier. Working with them has made me realize how much I took for granted. Not just the money, but the assumption that college was automatic, that someone would always be there to catch me if I fell. He paused, looking at me directly. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that you were always the one catching all of us." Michael raised his glass of wine from a vineyard I'd invested in 5 years earlier, though I'd decided some secrets were worth keeping. "To second chances," he said, and to finally seeing each other clearly. To authentic relationships, Rebecca added, smiling at me across the table, even when they're more complicated than we expected. As the sun set over the water and my family talked excitedly about scholarship recipients and investment strategies and the community garden project we were funding at Emma's college, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The simple pleasure of being known completely and loved. Anyway, the word burden hadn't been spoken in our family for months, but its absence wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that Tyler now asked for my advice because he respected my expertise, not because he was humoring an elderly relative. What mattered was that Michael included me in decisions because he valued my input, not because he felt obligated, to keep me informed. What mattered was that when Emma called with news about her studies or her relationships or her dreams for the future, she was talking to her grandmother, the person, not her grandmother, the responsibility. I was no longer invisible in my own life, no longer diminished by good intentions or protected from my own capabilities. I was simply Betty Morrison, investor, philanthropist, grandmother, and finally, authentically, myself. The fortune had always been real, but the freedom to live as the woman who'd earned it, that was the true treasure that Thanksgiving had finally given back to me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.